There is a fish in the James River that now outweighs everything else in the river combined. In stretches of this water, 3 of every 4 pounds of anything alive is the same single animal. It did not come from here. It was carried in buckets, on purpose, more than 50 years ago. The largest one ever pulled from the James weighed 102 pounds. And the divers who go down to inspect the dams have started refusing to go back into the water. What they say they saw is almost certainly a lie. What is actually down there is worse. Picture the water first. Not the surface, where the light still reaches and a kayak slides across it on a Saturday afternoon. Go lower. Past the last of the green, into the part of the river the sun has never once touched, where the channel drops away below the dams at Richmond, into holes 40 and 50 feet deep, and the cold sits perfectly still, and the silt hangs in the black like smoke that never settles. A diver goes down there because a dam has to be checked. Concrete has to be felt with a gloved hand, because at that depth you cannot see your own fingers. And somewhere in that dark, so the story goes, the diver's light finds something the size of a grown man lying flat against the base of the wall. It does not startle, it does not flee. The diver comes up, peels off the gear, and says very quietly that he will not be going down there again. Hold on to that story. We are going to come back to it because it turns out to be the single most important thing about this river, and it is the part that is not true. The truth does not need a man-sized monster. The truth is written in survey data, measured in tons, and it is stranger than anything the legend ever managed. Start in 1974. Back then, the fish did not exist in Virginia at all. Blue catfish are native to the middle of the continent, to the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, the great muddy rivers that drain the heart of the country. They had never swum in an Atlantic river in their lives. But the striped bass were crashing all up and down the East Coast, and Virginia's Fisheries Agency, then called the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, wanted to give anglers something big to chase. So they chose a fish that gets enormous. Between 1974 and 1985, the state released more than 300,000 young blue catfish into the James, the Rappahannock, and later the York. Buckets of them, fingerlings, most no longer than your hand, dropped into the founding river of English America, a few miles up from where the first colonists had stepped ashore. The people who did it were not reckless. They believed they understood the limits. Blue catfish are freshwater fish, and the Chesapeake Bay is salt. The reigning assumption was simple and comforting. The bay would act as a wall. The catfish would stay in the rivers where they were dropped, grow into trophies, and stay put. Every fish has its water. This one would keep to its own. That was the explanation. It held for years. And for years there was a second story too, told in tackle shops and around boat ramps. And it was even better than the science, because it had a monster in it. You've probably heard some version of it yourself. Divers go down to work on a dam. They come up shaking, refusing to finish the job, and what they saw at the bottom was a catfish the size of a car. The details drift from telling to telling. Sometimes it is a bridge footing. Sometimes it is a body recovery. Sometimes the fish is as big as a Volkswagen, sometimes as big as a truck. The fact checkers at Snopes traced this exact legend back to the early 1950s and found it attached to nearly every dammed lake and river across the American South and Midwest. It is one of the most durable pieces of folklore in the country, and in almost 80 years of the story being told as gospel, nobody has ever produced the diver or the fish or the photograph. So that is where we stand at the halfway point of the reassurance. The scientists said the bay would hold the line. The folklore said the only thing to fear was a giant in a hole. Both stories let people stop looking, and both of them, in their own way, were wrong. If you are the kind of person who wants to know what is actually living in the water near you, and not just the version that is comfortable, consider subscribing before we go further. This channel exists to follow the thing everyone else stopped watching, and there is always a next one coming. Now here's where the clean explanation breaks. The bay did not hold the catfish. The catfish learned the bay. It turned out that blue catfish can tolerate far more salt than anyone expected, moving through brackish water from one river mouth to the next, the way they do in the coastal Gulf of Mexico. They did not stay where they were put. They walked the whole coast underwater. By 2023, the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources had documented blue catfish in every single one of Virginia's tributaries to the Chesapeake Bay. Every one. The wall the state was counting on was never a wall at all. And they did not merely spread. They took over. In parts of the James and the Rappahannock, surveys began finding that blue catfish made up as much as 75% of the total fish biomass. Read that again, slowly. Not 75% of the catfish. 75% of every pound of fish in the water. 3 out of every 4 pounds of living thing you could haul up is one introduced animal. A biologist with Virginia Tech estimated that somewhere between 750 million and 1 billion pounds of blue catfish now swim in the Chesapeake Bay system, a weight greater than every other species in the bay put together. So what does a fish like that eat when there are that many of it, and it will eat almost anything? A fish like that only gives up its secrets when you open it, so they opened more than 16,000 of them. Working across the James and its sister rivers, a team led by a scientist named Joe Schmidt collected and cataloged the stomach contents of more than 16,000 blue catfish from over 500 separate locations in what became one of the most thorough diet studies ever conducted on any single fish species anywhere. They brought the fish up with electrofishing gear, a low current run through the water that stuns whatever is down there and floats it briefly to the surface before it sinks back into the dark. In a single hour of that work, one survey crew counted more than 6,000 catfish rising around the boat. And when the stomachs were open, the picture that came out was not the simple one everybody expected. The blue catfish turned out to have one of the widest diets ever measured in an estuary fish. In one stomach, researchers found a partially digested wood duck with no birdshot anywhere in it, which meant the fish had not scavenged a hunter's leftovers. It had pulled a living duck down off the surface and swallowed it whole. In another, near Richmond, a stomach came up full of raw sewage and a condom. This is an animal that reads the entire river as food, without preference and without limit. It ate Asian clams by the thousand. It cleared mats of underwater plants. It ate crabs, and shad, and menhaden, and herring, and each other. What it did not do, oddly, was specialize. In one nearby river system, when the scientists went looking for striped base inside the catfish, in thousands of stomachs they found only 2, and not a single sturgeon, which suggested the catfish might not be the personal executioner of every native species people feared. But the researchers were quick with the catch to that. One catfish is not an assassin. There are millions of them. And together they move through the river like a slow flood, and it does not take many of them working on any one species to erase it entirely. And then a second group put a number on the flood. Working from a population estimate of nearly 6 million blue catfish in the tidal James as of 2015, researchers calculated that in a single year those fish consumed roughly 4,500 tons of aquatic life. The largest share, more than 900 tons, came out of the shad family. Another 440 tons was blue crab, an amount equal to about 5% of Virginia's entire commercial crab catch that year, gone into catfish, uncounted, before a waterman ever set a pot. That study was published in the journal Marine and Coastal Fisheries. These are not folklore numbers, they are arithmetic. And that arithmetic points at one particular casualty. And this is the part of the story that should actually stop you. Long before the catfish, the James River had a king. Not a predator, a traveler. The American shad, the largest fish in the herring family, born in this river and returning to it every single spring to spawn, the way its ancestors had returned for something close to 10,000 years. The writer John McPhee called the shad America's founding fish, and on the James that was nearly literal. When the first English colonists reached this water in the early 1600s, they wrote home in astonishment at the shad runs, at schools so dense the river seemed to turn solid. Every spring, more than 1 million shad would fight their way up the James as far as 250 miles inland, past Richmond and on toward Lynchburg. Watermen built entire livelihoods on that run. Virginia politicians campaigned over planks of smoked shad. Families kept recipes for the roe passed down for generations. The shad was not a fish here. It was a season. It was the calendar. And now it is gone. Not dwindling. Gone. The decline was slow at first, and it had many fathers, and the catfish was the last of them to arrive. Long before an introduced fish ever ate a single shad, this river was being taken apart from the top down. Dams rose across the fall line at Richmond and sealed off the upstream water where the shad had always gone to lay their eggs. The bottom silted over, and the hard, rocky ground the eggs needed turned to soft mud that smothered them. And then, in the middle of all of it, the James was poisoned so badly that the state had to shut it down. You may not know the name Kepone. In Virginia, people over a certain age will never forget it. Kepone was the brand name for a pesticide called chlordecone, a fine grayish-white dust, and it was made in a town called Hopewell, about 20 miles downriver from Richmond, in a makeshift plant tacked onto the back of an old gas station. For years, first the Allied Chemical Company, and then a small subcontractor called Life Science Products manufactured the stuff and poured the waste straight into the James. The men who handled it began to shake. Their hands first, then their whole bodies, a tremor that would not stop. 29 of them were hospitalized. And when investigators finally examined the river those men had been feeding the chemical into, they found it laced all the way down, in the sediment, in the fish, in the crabs. On the 17th of December, 1975, the governor of Virginia stood in front of reporters and closed the James River to all fishing for 100 miles, from the fall line at Richmond down to the Chesapeake Bay. Not for a season. The ban held in one form or another for 13 years. It was not fully lifted until 1988. For more than a decade, a river that had fed this state since before it was a state was declared unsafe to eat from. An entire generation of watermen lost their incomes, and some lost their livelihoods for good. Allied Chemical eventually paid out around $30 million in fines and settlements, and to this day, a quiet caution about eating too much of certain fish from the James has never entirely gone away, because Kepone does not break down. It just settles into the mud and stays. So understand the ground that the catfish walked onto. By the time the introduced fish reached its full, overwhelming numbers, the shad were already reeling. The dams had blocked them, the silt had smothered them, the poison had emptied the river of fishermen and left the survivors carrying a residue in their flesh for years. In 1994, Virginia gave up and banned shad fishing outright, a moratorium meant to let whatever was left recover in peace. The river was supposed to heal, and in many ways, it did. The James is far cleaner now than it was in the 1970s, when scientists reckon its overall health would have rated close to the bottom of any scale. The water runs clearer. The bald eagles came back to the banks. On paper, the recovery is real, and it is a genuine achievement, and the people who fought for it are right to be proud. But underneath that recovering surface, the arithmetic had already turned. The animal that would finish what the dams and the poison started was already grown and already beyond counting. Now listen to what that meant for the shad. The Virginia Institute of Marine Science runs a survey every spring during the run, netting the river to see how many come home. In the year 2020, across the entire season, they found 6 American shad in the James. The next year, 2021, they found 2. And in the most recent State of the James report, compiled by the James River Association, the surveyors pulled their nets and counted 0. Not a low number. 0. American shad now sit at 0% of the recovery goal set for this river. The founding fish of Virginia, the fish that met the first colonists, the fish that ran this water for 10,000 springs, has effectively vanished from it inside a single human lifetime. In the same decades that an introduced catfish grew to own 3 of every 4 pounds in the river. That is the monster, not a giant in a hole. A quiet exchange. One animal subtracted, one animal multiplied, and almost nobody on the banks noticed the trade being made. If you have ever stood on a bridge over the James, or fished it, or swum in it as a kid without a second thought, I would like to know where you were, and how close. Leave it below. Most people who grew up beside this river have no idea what has changed underneath it while they weren't looking. Which brings us back to the divers, and to why the size of these fish is not the point, even though the size is real. Blue catfish do get big, and they are getting bigger here, not because of any single monster, but because of time. This species can live 20 to 25 years. The oldest one ever aged in Virginia, a fish from the Rappahannock, was 25 years old. They keep growing throughout their lives, and they add weight faster as they get older. A population that was seeded 50 years ago has now had 5 full decades to grow its first arrivals into old, heavy giants. The state record from the James, 102 pounds, was landed back in 2009. The species tops out around 65 inches and 143 pounds. Survey crews on the James routinely handle fish in the 30 to 50 pound range and pulled an 87 pounder from the nearby Kepone. There are fish in the deep channels of this river right now that are older than the boats floating above them and heavier than the children swimming near the banks. So when a diver goes down into one of those cold holes below a dam, in water too dark to see a hand in front of a mask, and his light lands on a fish 4 or 5 feet long, motionless against the concrete, patient in the way only a very old animal is patient, the fear he feels is not folklore. The animal is real. The legend just got the meaning wrong. The thing to be afraid of was never that the catfish would hurt the diver. The thing to be afraid of is that the catfish is a receipt. It is proof of how much of the river has already been eaten and turned into that one dark, waiting shape. And here's the part that nobody can resolve. The part where 3 uncomfortable answers sit side by side, and no one can tell you which is true. The first is the simplest and the darkest. The blue catfish is now the top of this river, a generalist that eats through every native species trying to recover, and the takeover is permanent. Under that reading, the shad will never come back. The crab will keep bleeding tonnage every summer. And the James is simply a blue catfish river now, and will be for as long as there is a James. The second is more unsettling because it takes away the villain. That same enormous diet study concluded that blue catfish, for all their appetite, often feed lower on the food chain than their reputation claims. Much of what they eat is invasive clams and vegetation, not native game fish. Some researchers now describe them less as a lord of the river and more as a mid-level omnivore, a fish that simply eats what is abundant. If that is closer to the truth, then the catfish did not empty this river by itself. The dams did, the Kepone did, the silt, the water withdrawals, the warming, the century of slow damage did. And the catfish is not the killer standing over the body. It is the enormous, obvious thing that moved into the house after everyone else had already been driven out, and it takes the blame because it is the easiest thing to see. That is the harder story to sit with, because you cannot fix it by killing a fish. The third is the one Virginia is actually betting on. The plan now is to try to eat its way back out. The state has thrown its weight behind turning the invader into an industry, a program called River to Table that pushes blue catfish onto restaurant menus and into grocery cases, on the plain logic that the more people eat, the fewer are left in the water. Researchers at Virginia Tech have estimated that, managed well, a Chesapeake blue catfish fishery could be worth more than $1 billion a year. On paper, it is the rare invasive species that could pay for its own removal. But the paper and the river do not agree. Talk to the watermen and the processors who actually handle the fish, and the story turns bleak. There are men on the James who a decade ago would not touch a catfish, and who now process almost nothing else, and who will tell you flatly that they do not expect their businesses to survive another 10 years, because they cannot compete with cheap frozen catfish shipped in from overseas. A family on a budget can buy a breaded imported fillet for less than a Virginia waterman can sell the whole fresh fish straight off his own boat. The processing rules are tangled in a layer of federal oversight the young industry can barely afford. And the most efficient way to catch the fish in bulk, commercial electrofishing, is the very technique that stuns everything else in the water alongside them. So the state has kept it on a short leash, wary of what happens when a crew stunning a stretch of river shares that water with sport anglers running wide open. The one tool that might actually drive the numbers down is the one nobody has fully turned loose. And yet there is a faint, early signal that something is shifting. Recent surveys suggest the total weight of blue catfish in the James may finally be leveling off or even declining. But nobody can say why. It could be the harvest. It could be that the fish have eaten so far into the river that they are now running short of food and starving their own numbers down. It could be the population simply aging out. And a fish that lives 25 years, that can travel more than 500 river miles when it chooses to, that has already defeated every barrier we assume would stop it, is not a fish that gets removed on a schedule. If a river reversing itself this completely, this quietly, is the kind of thing you want to keep watching, this is the channel that keeps watching it. There is always another water where the same trade is being made under the surface, and I go looking for the next one so you can see it before it finishes. So this is what the authorities are left with, standing at the edge of the water they stocked. They do not know whether the crab population can survive losing that much every year, because there has never been a James-specific crab survey to measure the loss against. They do not know whether the shad can be brought back to a river that no longer belongs to them, or whether zero is simply where this story ends. They do not know if the biomass decline is real recovery, or just the sound of the river running out of things to feed its own invention. 50 years ago, a state agency poured 300,000 fingerlings into this water to give anglers a good afternoon, and no one alive can tell you how to take them back out. So go back down one last time, into the cold black below the dam, and let the diver's light find the fish. It is not a demon. It is not a car. It is 100 pounds of patient, ancient, out-of-place animal, resting in a hole where the founding fish used to spawn, in a river that turned into something else while the people on the banks kept calling it by its old name. Above it, near Richmond, a blue crab moves along the bottom and does not know it is prey. Somewhere in the current, maybe, one of the last American shad on the James turns in the dark, looking for a spawning ground that is buried, in a run that no longer arrives. And the catfish holds still, the way it has held still for 50 years, the way it will keep holding long after the last person who remembers the shad is gone. It was carried here in a bucket. It never agreed to stay small, or stay hidden, or stay where we put it. And the water is not tame. It only looks tame. The river is full. We just stopped being able to see what it is full of, and it is down there right now, in the dark, waiting. If you like this one, YouTube also thinks you're going to like the video already on your screen. Go find out why.